Because we attempted to battle the tyrant and raise ever higher the flag of our land. We were insurgents, and shameful was Ireland, and deep in the mire lay our banner so grand. But then, like the phoenix, we'll rise from the ember, and death to the tyrant our flag will unfold. They will remember that day in September they hanged Robert Emmet, most fearless and bold.
Welcome to another episode of the Irish People podcast. In this episode, we focus on one of Ireland's greatest revolutionaries, Anne Devlin. We are delighted to be joined by Mícheál O'Doibhilín. Mícheál is an expert on Anne, and he organises an annual commemoration for her in Glasnevin. He's also the author of an excellent book titled Anne Devlin, the Bravest of the Brave. Mícheál also runs Kilmainham Tales, which focuses on lesser-known historical Irish stories, and he was key to bringing Anne's story to the fore. You're very welcome, and thank you for joining us. Could we start then by giving a brief introduction about Anne, her background, her family, and how she became involved with Robert Emmet?
I mean, I've done two things on her, two books on her, or whatever. In the past, one which is her life story, and one is a collection of speeches which you give at her grave. I mean, the Devlin family, they're not originally from Wicklow. They moved down from around Lough Neagh, a place called Ardbow. They moved down in the early 1600s. They eventually ended up in Rathdrum, where Anne's father was a house builder, believe it or not. That's where he met his wife, Winnie. And they moved down a little bit to Cronybeg, where he rented some land, and they ran a farm there. Were really and truly, they were industrious people. He was a good, honest-to-God Catholic, mass every Sunday, the whole family, and all the week working hard. And that, mind you, was to save him later. They met Emmet really first, because during 1798, not just Anne's cousin Michael Dwyer, but her cousin Arthur Devlin, her cousin Arthur Devlin, and her cousin Arthur Devlin. There were four of them out there. It would appear, I think, that Brian's father's name was probably Arthur Devlin, so his brothers all had an Arthur Devlin in the family. But all of those went out, and they were involved in the 1798 rebellion. Brian himself wasn't involved, and Anne's family were not directly involved, but they did cater for anybody who was injured, came to them, they cared for them, they treated them, etc., and then let them go again. They would hide them, it was a safe house for them, etc. Now they went. Brian eventually got jailed over this, because there was a neighbour called Halpin, and he became an informer, a paid informer, quite a famous paid informer at the time. And his first act as an informer was to squeal on the Devlins. But he would claim that Brian Devlin was one of the worst people in Wicklow at the time. And he really tried to do him down. For some reason, it might have been a personal thing, whatever, but he did try to do him down. They got involved with Emmet when Anne's cousin, Arthur Devlin, arrived back. After the 1798 rebellion, Michael Dwyer couldn't maintain a whole force of people in the Wicklow Mountains. It was just too much to put on the local people to support them. So he told most of his followers to go join the British Army. It's where they get fed, it's where they get trained as soldiers, and it's where they could hide. And Arthur Devlin went off and did that. And he eventually became a recruiting sergeant for the British Army. And he ended up down around the south coast when Robert Emmet came back from the continent. He had escaped to the continent. He met his brother over there. And he came back from the continent and he met Arthur. Arthur resigned his commission in the British Army and came back to Ireland. So he dressed up as a sailor. And he arrived on the farm early in some days in 1802. And he asked us to see the master of the house, basically. And young kids who were outside playing, very nervous about this. And they went in, told their father there was a sailor looking for him. He came out, recognized Arthur, delighted to see him. They chatted for a while, and Arthur said that he was involved with Robert Emmet and what was going on, and wondered could he use the Devlin house as a base. Brian said, excellent, yeah, no problem. So Arthur went back to Robert Emmet and said, look, yes, we could use my uncle's house. So Robert came out to look at it, but Robert used to something bigger than this, an awful lot bigger than this, in fact. And he really didn't see the house as being suitable for what he wanted. On top of which, he knew he was going to have a lot of people coming to it. So he looked for another house. In the meantime, of course, Devlin by this stage were living in Rathfarnham. They'd moved out of Wicklow after 1798, after Brian had been held in jail. And they moved out for their own safety, moved into Rathfarnham. So Robert looked across the road, basically, across the field from where they were, into Butterfield Avenue. And there were, it's one of three houses. Nobody knows for sure which one he eventually selected and rented. So now he had a lovely house. But again, at a time when the neighbours would get suspicious, when they really needed to be careful what he was doing. So he decided to furnish the house as a house. Brian offered him a cart, a horse, a cow, etc., so he could make it look like a normal living house. But then he needed a housekeeper. And Arthur said, well, look, one of my cousins will do it, no problem. Thinking Julia Devlin, Anne's older sister. But she was really very nervous, fanciful girl. She seemed to be at the time to be more interested in fellas really than in rebellion or anything like this. But Anne jumped at the opportunity to do this. She really was more into getting out of the house and going on and earning her own way. She decided she offered to go and work for Emmet, but not for him really, but with him. She did make this point later that she wasn't paid. She went in as a housekeeper. Her keep was paid by her father, basically. He would supply her food and her clothing, and that would come from home. They weren't too far away. They were, maybe only a few hundred yards away. So she lived in with Emmet, lived there with him. She ran the house for him. She kept it clean. She kept it tidy. She did all the duties of a housekeeper. But on top of that, she was a partner in what was going on, and became really arguably his second in command. I suppose chief secretary might well be a better term for it, but she was involved in what he was doing all the way through. So that is pretty much how she got involved with it. Brian had gotten off. He'd already been in jail for nearly 3 years in Wicklow jail after the 1798 rebellion, and he was lucky. Said he was a hard worker. That was what saved him, because when he didn't defend himself in court when he finally got to court, the Halpin was in and said, "Oh, here he is. He's the worst rogue in Wicklow." But he just simply asked the judge for a character reference, and the judge said, "Look, I see him every day. I pass where he works every day. He's a hard-working man. There's no way he'd have time to do any of this. I don't believe Halpin." And he let him out. So he was lucky. So that it was after that they moved in to Rathfarnham, that for their own safety, thinking it was safe. It wasn't.
It's not a dissimilar relationship then from James Connolly and Winifred Carney.
Very much so. And you do see, let's be honest, you see this sort of relationship happening a lot in certainly the last couple of hundred years, really, in Irish revolutionary history. It does. And people talk about women being left out of history. They haven't. They've been there. They've been very involved with it. it's only really in recent times that they've been dropped out of the historical narrative. It's more when people talk about the battle, the gunfight, etc. So the men get involved in it, that the women get left out. But you look back over a lot of the early history. I mean, in 1916, I mean, Pearse was very aware of Anne Devlin's role, for example, when he was earlier in 1914, and when he was in the States trying to raise money for a school, and he often talked about Emmet, but he always talked about Robert and Devlin, and he always said wherever Emmet is talked about, Anne must be talked about. He saw them and knew of her significance, and others did as well. Michael Collins, she was his favorite woman in history. And you see it, and you see, as you say, Winnie Carney. You see other women who performed similar roles. Rose McNamara was another one in 1916 and during the War of Independence, etc. Lots of them out there who did this.
I think that's a really important distinction that you've made. You worked with Emmet rather than for him. So it's fair to say she made an impression on Robert Emmet fairly quickly, and he came to trust her.
Yeah, she certainly did. I mean, she turned out to be totally trustworthy. Now, remember that Robert at this stage was involved with Sarah Curran too. That was, again, something which he couldn't really do. I mean, it wasn't approved really by Sarah's father. So it had to be a little bit clandestine. They would just send letters to one another, etc., secret. Anne would deliver these and wait for a reply and bring them back to him, no problem, unquestioning. Anne says that when they were having meetings in the house with various people, Russell and others, about the rebellion, that she might walk into the room, and you would expect that they would stop talking when she'd walk in, but they didn't. Robert very quickly made clear that she was one of us, as he said. That he was to be totally trusted, and quite obviously, even when the others weren't there, he would discuss things with her. He would bounce the ideas off her. He would talk to her about his plans, etc., as he went through. So she was very much a confidant of his. And indeed, on the day of the rebellion, she was his second in command without question in what was going on. He grew to trust her. He grew, obviously because of her relationship as well. Michael Dwyer being a relative, Dwyer was brought into the house to meet with Emmet. Though Dwyer himself was quite skeptical. He was untrusting, really, of Emmet, and indeed didn't give a firm commitment, despite what people say, that he would take part in the rebellion. He said he needed a clear signal on the day that Dublin Castle had been taken before he would arrive. He also lied, of course. He said he'd bring 300 men. He didn't have that kind of numbers with him at all, but he said he would. So Anne knew most of the people who were involved. And this was to come to the fore later, but she knew not just the people who took part in the rebellion, but the people who financed it. I mean, Emmet himself had £2,000 or £3,000 to pay for this. A lot of money at the time, but he needed an awful lot more money. And Anne later tells us that she had maybe the names of 50 people who helped Emmet. And these would have financed him to the tune of maybe £100, maybe £500 each, a huge amount of money. And his rebellion really cost a fortune. Not so much for manpower, he didn't need that, but for development of weapons that he had, his new exploding planks and this sort of thing that he was trying out, his use of rockets, etc. All of this cost money, and to do it clandestinely, to have guns, to have pikes made, etc., in the quantity that he got them made, did cost a lot of money, and he needed. So Anne knew all the people who were subscribing to this as Emmet knew we could trust her with these names, and who they were. He relied on her pretty totally in the lead up to the rebellion and after it.
Emmet was incredibly lucky to find somebody as trustworthy and reliable as Anne.
I mean, you've got to remember the time. It was very much a class divides there. There were very, very huge class divides. Emmet was certainly upper class. Anne would have been middle to lower class. She knew her place. She was definitely subservient to him class-wise. But yet, and a fair play to Emmet, too. I mean, they crossed that divide. There was no class divide between the two of them. And it was, it was huge on Anne's part that she was able to break it. I mean, Emmet was fine with it, but I think if Anne had been simply a housekeeper, he would have seen her as lower to middle class and left it at that. But she broke that barrier herself and crossed over to be on a level with him. Totally trustworthy.
Could we talk briefly about the events of 1803 and Anne's arrest and her subsequent?
There's a lot of Ramesh talked about what happened on the day and after it. Basically, on the day, well, the rebellion, as we know, failed. It failed because of an alarm, which meant they started early. It failed because it was only Dublin based. It failed because there weren't enough weapons to go around, guns and that sort of thing to go around. The Kildare men, for example, wouldn't fight without guns. They went back home. But it's often said that it failed because it was a drunken mob, and it wasn't. I disagree with that totally. All day long, people were streaming into Dublin to take part in the rebellion. They had to stay somewhere. So where did they stay? They stayed in pubs. They stayed in coffee shops around. There were as many coffee shops then as there are now. And a lot of them stayed in those, waiting for the signal to come out. Now, the drunken mob that's talked about is the people who were working with Emmet in his depot off James's Street. And when he came out of there with these people, they had to get the other people out of the pub. So how do you get them out of the pub? You scream, you make noise, you sound. It may well have sounded like a drunken mob, but these people had spent all day working with black powder, etc., making explosives. You're not going to be drunk when you're doing that. You're going to have to be very careful. So these people were definitely sober. They were riled up because they'd been with Emmet and been listening to him talk about this, etc. They were certainly riled up. I accept that some people came out of the pubs to join them who would have been probably drunk, but the majority of them weren't. Lord Kilwarden was attacked on the day he was coming. He was actually, for his own safety, he had been called back to Dublin Castle, happened to get caught in the mob. He was killed. His son-in-law was killed, but his daughter shows how they weren't that drunk. They were able to escort her safely away, escort her over to her house, see that she was safe. Women weren't touched in those days, men only. War was between men, and that was it. But Emmet really, the sight of blood, I think, sort of did him in. He didn't want anybody to be hurt or killed in this rebellion, and he called it off very quickly. Now, word didn't get around to many of the others, including Anne's cousin Arthur Devlin, who was out down the quays leading another group of people waiting for the signal to start the rebellion. Word didn't get to them. Emmet left very quickly and got back home to Butterfield Lane. And that's where Anne attacked him and said, what have you done? You've destroyed us. She had spent all day. She'd been handing out weapons to people. She'd been handing out explosives to people. She'd been organizing it, passing messages on from one to the other, sending messages out all day. She had run the headquarters, basically, of this rebellion. And she was disgusted to see Emmet come back. She said, what have you done? What have you done to everybody? What have you done with the plans? Where's my brothers? Where's my cousin? And bad cess to you. She really was upset. She berated them. Now, Emmet simply said, if only I'd had another 1,000 men, if only he'd had another £1,000. But really, he'd had all he wanted to get. He had kept the thing so secret that it just couldn't be a big rebellion. This was the problem. And Anne berated him. Now, it wasn't until the next morning that Arthur Devlin managed to get out of Dublin. He'd fought through the night, and he came out the next morning. He got away safely. But Robert reckoned he couldn't stay in the house very long, and he moved out. He went over just across the field to the Devlin's house, and a group of them stayed over there briefly. Unfortunately, at breakfast, a neighbour came in you just left the door open all the time and they could walk in. So a neighbour came in, saw the strangers there, and went back home and sent word to Dublin Castle that they were in the Devlin house. They seem to be misfortunate with their neighbours, unfortunately. But so Emmet and crowd left. Anne was still in Butterfield Lane. She came back home thinking to be safer. The soldiers had come on the Tuesday, on the Sunday. The rebellion had been Saturday. The soldiers had come on the Sunday to Butterfield House looking for Mr. Ellis, which was Robert Emmet's pseudonym during this time. And they were told that she was tortured, she was half hanged, and etc. Yes, she was. She was stabbed, and she did bleed from the bayonets, etc. But there was no attempt to kill her. This was simply to get information. The half hanging was a normal procedure at the time to get information out of people, not to threaten to kill you, but to get you when if you're half unconscious, you don't know what you're doing. You probably spout out the truth. They didn't have pentothal or whatever it is they use nowadays to get the truth out of you. This is one of the ways they did to get the truth out of you. So dazed, you'll answer the questions correctly. But she wouldn't. She didn't. Said she didn't know. She was only a poor servant girl, blah, blah. And that was it. And her young sister was there with her as well at the time. So when the soldiers had gone, she went back to her father's house and stayed there. And next day, they were sleeping that night, and the next day, soldiers arrived in the morning and arrested the whole family and took them off. Now, they were brought as far as the Yellow House in Rathfarnham, and it was a good Republican pub, as it turned out, but the British often would drink there, and quite often in the lead up to the rebellion, Michael Dwyer, Arthur Devlin, etc., would be in the attic listening to what was going on downstairs. But they weren't at this time. The Devlins were brought there, and they were, Brian was ordered to drink. He refused to drink. They slit the back of his trousers, and they did that with all of the men of the family. So you had to walk holding your trousers. You couldn't run, obviously. Your trousers were going to fall off. So that made, that forced them to walk almost hobbled, as it were. They walked from the pub into Dublin. It sounds like a long way, but this was normal. There wasn't transport. It was normally done. Emmet used to walk from Dublin to Rathfarnham regularly. And they walked into Dublin Castle, and they were held there. They were held there quite some time, until August, in fact, to Dublin Castle. It's often thought that they were brought direct to Kilmainham Tales. They weren't. They were held in Dublin Castle first. There was a prison of sorts in Dublin Castle, and they could be held in that. They were held there. Plenty of rooms they could hold them in. And that's where they were held for questioning. And we actually have the record of the questioning of Brian Devlin and his wife Winnie. Their questions, and young Arthur, her brother, their questions are all there. Unfortunately, the questioning of Anne is not recorded. That memo has been lost somewhere in time. It's gone. They were there, as I say, for quite some time. Anne was questioned specifically by Town Major Sir. The first time she met him was there in Dublin Castle. He was the chief of the police on the north side of Dublin. Dublin was split in two. He was basically the chief of police on the north side, and he questioned her. He wanted information on who had backed the rebellion. He had much information on the rebellion itself, on who'd been involved and what had been said. And kept refusing, saying she knew nothing, she was only a poor servant girl, etc. This excuse she used all the time. And then Emmet, on one occasion, quoted to her what she'd said to Emmet when he'd come home on the night of the rebellion. And she knew that there was an informer in the group that were with him, but didn't know who. One of them was obviously an informer. But she still wouldn't say anything. They put her in one of the towers of Dublin Castle. They put what she didn't know was an informer in the room next to her. She thought he was just somebody who'd been arrested as part of the rebellion. And the idea was that he would trap her into saying something, but he didn't succeed in doing that. She was very, very careful and cagey about what she said to anybody. And this tended to cut her off, tended to make her appear almost aloof to people, because she just didn't trust anyone. I wouldn't talk to them at this point in time. And that was it. She stuck with that. So it was also in Dublin Castle that she met Dr. Trevor first. He came down. What people don't realize now, I have no physical evidence for this, I have no proof of this, but I do know from many other things that I've seen and read about them that Trevor and Town Major Sir were working very closely together. Trevor was the medical inspector of Kilmainham Jail, and he would question people or gain their confidence when they were in the jail. He could get information from them on crimes that had been committed, and he would pass this information back to Town Major Sir. Now, as Chief of Police, Sir could decide what reward there was for finding information on crimes. So Trevor would give him the information, Sir would solve the crime, Sir would get the reward, and they'd split the money. And they got quite a lot of money out of this. They really did. Sir spent most of his money on buying artwork and that. He thought himself as an art connoisseur, though he apparently didn't know anything about it. But Trevor apparently saved his money. But Trevor was brought down to talk to Anne. And he again tried the gentlemanly, soft-spoken approach with her, and suggested to her that she'd tell what she knows and wouldn't want to see her family in jail and all of this. But to no avail. And I think was pretty much suspicious of him. He seemed too smarmy, too, smooth talking for her, as far as she was concerned. So she didn't. But he got nothing. So he went away and left her again with Town Major Sir. Eventually, she was sent to Kilmainham Jail, and the whole family was, and they were held there. Anne now was separated from from her sisters and her mother and her father and her young brother. She was put into a small room. They knew obviously she was the person when you had the information, so she was the one they had to break. She was put into a small room, which is actually an under the stairs room in the basement of Kilmainham Jail. It's still there today, and when you see it, if you see it, it's tiny. It's only about, you could put your arms out and reach the walls on each side. It's got a sloping roof because it's under the stairs. It's quite deep, but no great value to it because of what's there. Where it was in its day, there was a sewer, an open sewer ran past it, and that would often overflow and flow into the room where she was. So an earthen floor. She had a bucket in it as a toilet, as would be normal down there, and she had to live in that. She was there for nearly 2.5 years. Trevor began to take over her life now at this stage. He would alternate between threatening her and offering her bribes. Every now and then she'd be taken out and brought back to Dublin Castle for formal questioning. But nothing would work on her. Town Major Sir offered her £500 at one stage for the information she knew, and she refused it. Now, you'd think what £500 is worth that to someone like that. It was pointed out to her that she could marry a farmer with 500 acres of land if she had a dowry of £500 with her. And, that would have left her as comfortable as she would want to be for her life. She would have been invited into Dublin Castle, the balls, etc., at that level. She would have been living a high life if she'd wanted it, and she refused it. It was an insult, really, to offer the money. She just wasn't going to pass it on any information from this. Again, it's said that she was tortured in Kilmainham Jail. And I think that's a little bit, that's an exaggeration or a misunderstanding of what happened to her. Yes, she was tortured, but not in the sense of being, put on a rack or, physically abused or whatever. That didn't happen. Just as in the rebellion, in jail too, you wouldn't touch a woman. Certainly any man who thought himself as a gentleman. And Trevor thought himself as a gentleman. He wasn't one, but he thought himself as one. And he wouldn't touch her. So what happened to her, the torture she received was primarily psychological torture. Being kept in a dark room on her own, sensory deprivation, dreadful food, all of this sort of thing, not getting information on her family, and all of that. This was the torture. It was just total deprivation, sensory deprivation. I believe me, I'm not playing that down. I know just how horrible that can be. This is the kind of torture she got, not the hanging up or the punishment, the physical punishment. It wasn't. Now, Trevor, he would often call down to her, and he would have a light with them, and he'd talk to her through the gate, and he would say to her, have you decided you're going to give the information yet, or whatever? And she would berate him or give out to him or whatever. At one stage, it was again typical of the time. The worst insult he could throw at her was, you rebelly bitch, he called her at one stage. And he said he'd only ever seen one woman hanged in his life. And if you ever saw another one, he wanted it to be Anne. That was him totally frustrated. He couldn't touch her, couldn't do anything. He just wished the worst he could on her was that she would hang. But again, equally, the one thing he didn't want was that she'd hang. Because if Anne was dead, he couldn't get the information from her. 50 people, they would have had a reward on them, probably of £500 each. So, you can figure out that was 25 grand in those days. Huge, huge amount of money. He would get half of that. They offered Anne £500. That was nothing out of all that. 10% they were offering her. It was nothing out of what the value of these people were. So he had to keep her alive at all cost. And that really is, to some degree, is what saved her. She got very ill. She got erysipelas. And erysipelas is a dreadful disease. It's a streptococcal thing. Known as St. Andrew's fire, because you just burn and burn and burn with it. Now, you get that from living in healthy conditions, as she was. Maybe an infected cut or something. She probably cut herself on something, and you get it from that. It was quite common in those days. It still occurs. There is still no cure for it. You can be controlled with penicillin, but of course they didn't have that in those days. The obvious thing is just keep clean. She got so bad because she just got bloated. Anne herself says she looked like a cow at one stage, physically big and fat and could hardly move. Trevor tried treating her. He was a chemist. He wasn't the doctor. He was a failed chemist, really. So at one stage he had to call in a real doctor to treat her. And this doctor came in and decided he would treat her. What he did was to slit her inner thighs open and just left her there in the filth, just to let her shrink a little bit. That was all he did. You can imagine the pain she would be in with this. He got crutches in. Trevor got her crutches so she could walk. But how can you walk? Your arms are sore, underarms. Imagine trying to lean on crutches. You couldn't do that. She just threw them back at him. So in desperation, he decided to send her out to the spa in Lucan. He sent her out there. There had a lot of problems about she couldn't go with two soldiers. She wouldn't be allowed. Again, this whole thing about women and men. She wouldn't be allowed in a coach with just two armed soldiers. So there had to be a chaperone, a woman with her. They wouldn't let, the people she wanted to go with her, they wouldn't let them go. They eventually got a woman to go with her, came out to Lucan, and over time, she came out several times. Eventually, they let Michael Dwyer's sister come out with her. But it didn't work. Anne didn't see it was doing her any good, and eventually they stopped sending her out. So it didn't work. And then she got lucky. William Pitt died in England, Prime Minister. There was a change of government. And the new government that came in said they wanted a list of all the prisoners who were in jails in Ireland, a complete list. And they were going to review them. And because some people have been there 3-4 years, never had a trial or whatever, they wanted to check this out. See, if they haven't been tried, put them on trial and let them go. That was the idea. Now, Trevor was really and truly scared that Anne would be let go. So he kidnapped her and brought her down to Dublin Castle. But with the collusion of town majors, sir, he hid her in Dublin Castle. Not even in the jail in Dublin Castle, but in a room, in a closet downstairs that Anne said was only a couple of feet wide, a little bit wide, but twice the width of a cot, of her bed. That was all. And it was only the length of the bed. So she had no room to move, pitch dark, no light in there. So she was held there. But Mrs. Hanlon who was the wife of the jailer in Dublin Castle. Well, she was a widow now because Hannah had been killed. She called in to see Anne, and she used to clean her up, wash her, and give her some food and go off. And she started to write to the first secretary, to Mr. Long, the chief secretary, who was only across the courtyard. But again, so formal were things then, you couldn't just drop in and talk to him. She used to write to him and tell him, about Anne. And he ignored her. Eventually he wrote back and said, you're lying. No one can be in the condition she's in. And eventually she begged him and pleaded him. And eventually, just to get her off her back, he said, show me her. She brought it. Mrs. Hanlon brought him down. He nearly vomited when he saw the condition she was in. He immediately went back to his office and wrote a release. So Mrs. Hanlon brought her out to her own rooms, hired a coach, sent her sister with her, and sent her back to her family. At this stage, the family were living in rented accommodation in Dublin. They'd lost the farm, they'd lost everything. Her father was on his deathbed. And Anne came home. She was still desperately ill. Took her a while to get over this. This is 1806 now. She's been 2.5 years in jail. Took her a little while to get over this, but she was lucky. Although nobody could openly come and help her, people were aware of what she'd suffered and what she'd done. The Emmets, that whole family, they could surreptitiously help. Hannah's, Mrs. Hanlon, she got a job with her on John Rogerson's Quay as a lady's companion. And Mrs. Hanlon was an old woman. So a lady's companion, all she wanted was someone to sit and talk to her, go out with her when she went out in the street and whatever. Suited Anne. She was a born chatterbox, despite the fact that she'd said nothing later in jail. So it suited her to have a job like this where she could recuperate. She got clean clothes because, as she would have to be reasonably well dressed, Mrs. Hanlon would give her last year's cast-offs. So she would be a year behind the fashion, but not too bad. And she would look well. She was treated very well there while she was there. Mrs. Hanlon even paid to have her portrait painted. That's a little horrible illustration we see all the time, because the portrait has been lost, and we're looking at a copy of a copy of a copy. It was a miniature painter called Leyden. It is a female painter in Parnell Street. She did it. Mrs. Hanlon was getting her own one done, and she got Anne's done at the same time. So that was great, except that Mrs. Hanlon went and died. She died in 1810. So suddenly Anne's out of a job again. And that's when a very interesting thing happens. Next year, she's marrying a man called William Campbell, who's 13 years older than her. He's, 43 or something? She's 30 or so at the time. And yet she's marrying him. It's a sudden and unexpected marriage. Now, the Campbells were also a friend of the Emmets. And it's quite likely that this was a guy, again, further down the family a bit. Maybe he'd had a wife and she died, or maybe he wasn't very good with women and never had a wife, or what, who knows. Doesn't matter. He was a carter and he married Anne. And they had a reasonably good life together. But very interesting is that we know it was a surprise. And it also gives us some information of what Anne's life was like for the rest of her life. Because in 1811, there's a police report from P.C. Scott. He's writing to Tam Major Surrey, submitting this report on following Anne for a day. And he's following her to find out where she lived, because they'd lost sight of her when she got married. There was a sudden, she obviously hadn't been wooed by William Campbell. They hadn't been going out together. They didn't know about it, didn't know where she was. So she had vanished as far as they were concerned. So he followed her for the day, and he saw her go to her doctor, to Dr. Todrick in South Frederick Street. She came back. She went up to the hospital in the Coombe. And really, Dr. Todrick specialized in pain, and ventilation was his big thing, his cure for everything. Ventilation, as in having plenty of air. But he was sitting around private rooms because it was cheaper for him than having to be in the hospital when she came up. She came back, went to up to where she lived. She changed her clothes, obviously. From good clothes, she would have gone to see the doctor, and to the poor clothes, she gone up to see the hospital. I would believe she got her prescription filled up there, which is painkillers, came back home, and then went on a tour around Dublin, doing various messages around Dublin. And he followed her all the time, came back, and went home. And eventually he finishes by saying she went into number one to Mullinahack, which I believe was her home. No, he was wrong. She went right through the house and out the back, because that's where they were living, because they were living in a mews, because her husband, of course, had a horse. He needed to stable it. So that's where they were living. So she was living in John's Lane, at the back of it, at the back of the church there. That's where she was living at that time. But they had a good life. She got a job now in oh God, what's the name of the hospital? It's gone from my mind now. Oh dear God. Anyway, she got a job in a hospital, and she was in charge of the laundry there. And again, this was run by Campbells again, Mr. and Mrs. Campbell. They were running the hospital. And Anne was being paid £63 a year. Now that was an incredible wage, absolutely incredible wage. There appeared to be some problems with the finances of the hospital, and the Campbells were, as they said, allowed to resign. But then Anne was fired, and her replacement got £18 a year. So you can see the kind of money she'd been on. Now, obviously, she was now back out the street, but she went back to original thing now that she'd been doing since she got married, which was to wash clothes for the hoi polloi. Her husband obviously collected with his horse and cart, so she could really have a good business going. They had 4 children. They may have had more, but there seems to be a couple of gaps in the ages, so maybe a couple more were born and didn't survive, but certainly she had 4 children, and 2 boys and 2 girls. She was doing fine until around the time of the famine. Her husband died, 1846, sorry. He died. And that really was when things took a turn for the worst for her. He died. She bought a grave for him in Glasnevin. I reckon that was probably the last major expenditure she had in her life. And she had him buried there. And then things started to go down, because she got arthritis. She has erysipelas. She can't move about so much. Husband, no one to collect laundry for her anymore, or whatever. She can't. So she's running out of money now. Starts to run out of money. At a time when things were getting expensive in Dublin, with the famine, potatoes in particular were going up in price. Other edibles, because obviously you can't eat potatoes, you'll eat other things. So all prices are rocketing in Dublin. She can't afford a lot of this, and her children can't support her either. One of her daughters had become a drug addict, probably addicted to the medicine she and herself had been on, which is basically the painkillers. In those days, it would have been mostly drugs like laudanum and that in it. So probably got addicted to that. She went off to the States and died in a nursing home in the States in New York. The other daughter got married just after Anne's husband died in 1846. She got married to a man called McGuinness, and they relatively had a child, a boy. But then he died. The husband died. So here you have a widow with a young child in the middle of a famine. Not really, she wouldn't have been able to help very much. Anne's 2 sons. Well, one of them was a sickly child always. Indeed, the day before she died, she's seen nursing him, because he would often call to her. And she would mind him for a while while he got through whatever was wrong with him. And the other son seems to have, well, he didn't vanish, he was there, but they would try and give her rent occasionally, but it didn't matter. She went down and down and down. Eventually, in 1851, she had to move from John's Lane to Little Elbow Lane, just up the other end of Mead Street. But that was the worst slum in Dublin. And Dublin had the worst slums in Europe at that stage. She ended up in the garret in an attic there, and she still tried to do laundry for people, but she couldn't do much because she couldn't bring it up the stairs. So she used to do it down the street. And she'd wash the clothes out there in a big bucket out the street there. Thomas Campion, a historian, visited her, heard of her there, visited her, and he actually wrote a long poem about her, about the kids annoying her and saying, "Tell us about Emmet, tell us about 1803." You know what kids would be like. They'd be ribbing her, and about how she resisted all the informers, etc. And that's where she lived until she died. I mean, that was where R.R. Madden, historian, met her. Brother Luke Cullen met her as well there, but they lost touch with it because Luke Cullen couldn't afford to. He was teaching in Clondalkin, in a teaching order out there, but he had no money. He couldn't afford to just come in to see her even. R.R. Madden did have money, but he was often sent away, and he was sent away to the States. He was a civil servant on business at one stage. Campion appears to have only met her once, maybe twice, so that was it. But Anne continued until she eventually died in 1851. She died in her room on the 18th of September, 1851. That 2 days before the anniversary of Emmet's execution on the 20th of September. So she probably struggled to stay on as long as she could to get that far. But she died of starvation in a miserable room with no furniture in it, nothing. She'd burned everything for a bit of heat. She'd no clothes because she'd pawned. The day before, she'd been down in Meath Street. She'd pawned the last of her clothes to get a loaf of bread. And she died of starvation, found dead in her room on the 18th of September. Now, she was taken in a pauper's coffin to Glasnevin and buried there. She was buried with her husband in the grave she paid for. What happened next was that R.R. Madden arrived back a few weeks later and went to the room where she'd been, met the woman who'd been subletting to her, and she explained to him what had happened, that she'd found her dead and she'd been taken off in a pauper's coffin to Glasnevin. Madden jumped to the conclusion that pauper's coffin, pauper's grave. So he talked to the couple of Anne's relations that he knew, to the friends that he knew, and about 6 months later, they arranged with Glasnevin a funeral for a woman called Aunt Devlin. And they went out, they got a grave for her, they went out to Glasnevin, dug Anne up surreptitiously, and then carried her over. This was the new funeral they were having, and buried her where she is now. Then R.R. Madden got a headstone put on that for her. Very, nice of him to do. And there she stayed, but the husband was still in the other grave. And that really, to me, was an insult to her, because she wanted to be buried with them. She did want to be buried with them. She believed you should be buried with your friends. There's a story, I could go back to it another time, about her first actual thing she did back in Wicklow, anti-government thing she did, was to move one person to another to be buried with his friends, and she wanted to do it. She believed you should. She said at the time, you should be buried with your friends. And truly, the only person she'd had for most of her life, the only friend she'd had, was William Campbell. So she was moved. Now, it happened in the early 1902, I think. The board of Glasnevin realised that she was in a grave that she shouldn't be in. They donated that grave to her straight away. But she's still officially buried in the other grave. She's actually buried in two graves up there, officially. So that's her. She's still there. We now, for the last 13, 14 years, we have a commemoration every year on the Sunday nearest the 18th of September. And I run a commemoration up there. In recent years, we've been having the Lord Mayor has come to it a couple of times. We've had notable people. Martina Devlin, the writer, for example, gave the guest speech. Last couple of years we couldn't, obviously, but we'll be back to it this year with it. So that's where she is, still fighting to get her husband moved.
I came across that story myself, actually, about Anne moving people into graves to be with their friends. I think it is important that her husband is moved to be buried alongside her. It's clearly what she he wanted?
I'm determined to do it, but I keep running up against bureaucracy. I mean, I applied to the government first, and ideally it should be a state funeral or some form of state thing anyway to unite the two of them. But no, that didn't happen. But then they put me on to the relevant minister, who said, no, you got to go to Fingal County Council. It's their area. So I got on to them and they said, no, you got to go back. It's the Minister for Housing, would you believe? The Minister for Housing is the person responsible for housing her in a new grave, for him in a new grave. But eventually you go, of course, it's not the minister, it's somebody underneath him and it's suddenly underneath him again. Eventually you had to get back to Glasnevin because it's a private graveyard. So I got onto them, and eventually, after about 2 years, I got a reply from them, which was that I would have to have permission from all of her descendants to move, or all of his descendants to move the body.
That is an incredibly ludicrous amount of red tape.
And what I had to do, they said, was to get a registered genealogist to do the research and to contact every relative that they found. Now, I mean, I've been looking at this story for 30 odd years, longer. I won't tell you how long. I've been looking at this story a long time. I have found 2 descendants. One is in America, one's in Australia. They're the only people I have found related to the Campbells come down that side. And, you know, they've given me written permission. I have it. But that's not enough. I mean, I started getting suspicious and thinking, is this, I appreciate you have to do it right. At the same time, I think a requirement for all of the relatives, is off the wall, realistically. I mean, if you think she should have thousands of descendants at this stage, so you can't possibly approach them all, most of them are not interested. They don't know who they're related to. These 2 do. They know who they're related to very much. They've given me permission. I obviously would give permission. So there's no problem as far as I'm concerned. I think you've just got a representative sample of people who have come forward or are being discovered, and that's it. You can trace the Dwyers down. They're okay. They have a definite line here in Dublin, a definite line in Australia. The Arthur Devlin in Australia is Anne's cousin, so it's not in relation to the marriage. We should be able to do it. I'm not giving up. I'm going to keep on at it. Eventually we'll get there. We'll do it. But in the meantime, we continue to honour every year.
So I came across a story that Emmet was brought in to see Anne when she was in prison. Is that true, or is that a myth?
Slightly. What happened was that Emmet was allowed out into the yard for exercise. And he was out there, he was playing tennis, he basically had a bat, he played the ball off the wall. And they brought Anne out, let her out. She was very surprised at this because they did not normally let her out. On the way out, she saw Edward Trevor and another man standing at a window looking out, and she realized what was going on. They let her out into the yard where she saw Emmet, and she was so surprised. Now, her normal reaction would have been to run over and, give him a hug and say, how are you, whatever. But knowing what was going on, she ignored him. And she bent down to fix her shoe or something. And Emmet hit the ball and brought it near her, and she said, we're being watched, to try and see if she knew him, because she maintained she didn't know, of course, in jail. She didn't have a clue who he was, because they still thought that Alice and Emmet were different people. They hadn't realized that. And she'd worked for Mr. Ellis. So she pretended to know. So Emmet would hit the ball near her, they'd pass, he'd whisper something, and she'd whisper back. And that was when he told her to tell everything she knew. Not about the others, but about him, that he was a dead man anyways, he said. But he wouldn't go to his grave happy if he thought she was going to be harmed. Now, her immediate reply was, you of all people to tell me to squeal on anybody. I couldn't possibly do that. It doesn't matter who it's on. She couldn't possibly inform. And then she was brought back into the jail, and she never saw him again. That was it. I mean, what saved her in the jail was Mrs. Hannah. The jailers, well, as it turned out to be later, the jailer's wife. She used to come down. You need to know the layout of the jail, but basically she would pass by Anne's cell on her way out from her own rooms. And she would see her, and she realized how badly off she was. Occasionally she'd come down, she'd get her out of the cell, bring her down to her own room, give her wash her, clean her up, and give her some wine and food. You wouldn't drink the water in the jail, so it had to be something like wine. Trevor could do nothing about this. He found them together one day, and he was livid, but he couldn't do anything about it because what Anne never knew was that Mrs. Hamlin was actually Trevor's mistress at the same time. She possibly was a prisoner herself, and Trevor had given her better conditions on condition of blah blah, and eventually passed her on to the jailer himself as a wife because she was pregnant and she had wanted to get married. And Trevor, of course, was already married, so he couldn't do that. Long story, and that's a different one for another day.
To finish up, what is her importance and her relevance today?
Yeah, I mean, Anne was staunch. Loyalty was a big thing with her. She believed in what Emmet was looking for, which was equality, a non-religious country, one of which religion was not a dominant thing, one of which, no matter what your religion was, you would be fine. Emmet was perhaps very much a dreamer. I mean, I think what he was looking for, he wasn't going to get. But if you don't aspire to it, you're not going to get it. But Anne joined in with them very, very well and wanted what he wanted, not for herself, never for herself, any more than Emmet wanted it for himself. They wanted it for all. Anne today is a vitally important person because she shows the value of being staunch, of being true, of defending others. Imagine what would have happened if Anne had given the information she had to Trevor or to Sir. Those 50 people that she protected, they would have been arrested. Now, because they were powerful people, they might have been executed or anything like that, but they would have been destroyed, probably deported at least. They would have been wiped out. Now, because Anne protected them, they lived on. They continued to make money. They were able to send their children to good schools. They were able to tell the children what they had been supporting in 1803. They were able to pass on Emmet's ideals to their children. They could pass it on eventually to their children, and so on down. So we got the Fenian Rebellion, we got the Young Irelander Rebellion, all coming out of this. Remember, the Young Islander one in particular was driven from the top, from prominent people, probably children of these people. And the whole tragedy of 1803 was remembered then, came down through these other rebellions, eventually until 1916. It inspired that again. And even indeed, you can look at something like the Invincibles was still, these all descended from this. 1916, Pierce rather was talking about Anne. He was talking about Emmet. Others too in that rebellion remember them and talked about them, used them constantly as references. Even when you go on to the War of Independence, they're still there. I mean, I've seen a document in which Michael Collins was asked, there used to be a house game. When you went to the house game, you had to answer questions, and one of them was, who was your hero in Irish history, and who was your heroine in Irish history? And Collins said that Anne Dowden was heroine in Irish history. She inspired him. So again, you're looking at strength. Even indeed, you look at in 1916 and after a couple of the women there were actually called Anne Devlin. It's a name that came on and on and on down. She inspired people all the way through. and today in particular, we've just come through COVID, we come through lockdown, we come through year and a half, 2 years of lockdown, and we complain about it. We were all in relative comfort at home and went through 2.5 years of complete lockdown in Kilmainham jail. But after that, she went through the rest of her life, so 45 years of solitary confinement. Because that policeman or other policeman followed her all through her life. We know there's a couple of reports of it, and they followed her right up to the day she died. And they walked openly behind her to scare people off. Now, that was an order that came from 1806 through 3 different police forces in Dublin and still existed in 1851. They were still following her. And she lived all that time without complaint, with no friends. You couldn't come near her because you'd be arrested as being a Republican or a nationalist. So they all had to avoid her. So she lived, apart from her husband, apart from her children, she was nobody near her. We complain about 2 years of it. She had 45 plus years of this, with obviously illness, etc., to go through. Her strength alone in that is unbelievable, when you think about it. Inspiring, really, I think she is. I know of, there are many other women who are in Irish history who are tremendous, but nobody to me who had the strength, the depth of character, the commitment that Anne has had all the way through. She never wavered once, never once in all of that.
So Anne would have known Demi Hope and Thomas Russell, people who had survived 1798.
Of them himself, Demi Hope, Michael Dwyer. These were all people who were involved directly with Emmet, and they would have been involved in, his committee, as it were, organising this rebellion. And yeah, she knew them all, knew all of them. Like that, she wouldn't squeal on any of them, none of them, not one. And many of them were executed afterwards. The incredible thing is that there were more people executed after Emmet's rebellion than there were in 1916. There's 22 after Emmet's rebellion, 16 in 1916. All hanged. Couple of them, were hanged, drawn, and quartered, as Emmet was. So yeah, a huge number for a tiny rebellion. Again, just a Dublin-based rebellion, really. Again, a huge stamping down that the government did, the British government here. Our government was British. That what they did, the reaction, the stamping down on what was going on, the attempt to stamp it out. They couldn't do it, of course, but they did try and got all the leaders and took them out of it. So yeah, Anne, I think she's an inspiration in many ways. Apart from her strength, that's the first thing you get from her. The life she lived was, in many regards, an ordinary life. In other regards, it was exceptional because she was isolated. She had a contagious disease, erysipelas. She had children who failed her, really, through no fault of their own, but who did fail her. But all of this would have been fairly typical, really, or much of this would have been fairly typical at the time. But through all of it, she never complained openly about what went on, whatever she might have done at home with the husband. But she took her lot. She accepted her lot in life. Certainly, when she was talking to R.R. Madden, she did say that these people she was protecting, she'd pass them in the street and they wouldn't even greet her, and she complained about that. She, felt bitter about being ignored. But there's a policeman walking a few yards behind her. If you greet her, you're marked, you're arrested, and that was it. So they couldn't do anything about that with her. So no, they couldn't support her. She worked hard all her life, and she lived a long life. I think she was 71 when she was 81 when she died. Sorry, she was 71 when she died. again, a long life for the time, and with the conditions she had, the problems she had, a very long life indeed. She lived to despite them as much as anything else. She just wouldn't die until nothing she could do, until she starved to death. That was it. She had other heroes apart from Emmet. Daniel O'Connell is a big hero of hers. In the years before she died, he died. He rang out the bells in the churches every hour in the days after he died. And she used to, whenever she heard the bells ringing out, they'd remind her, of course, that he'd be gone, and she'd cry. Certainly in later years, she may well have thought more of him than she did of Emmet, in the sense that he was looking for a peaceful solution. He tried political actions. Emmet tried to get, to do it by force. And that was it. And of course, Daniel did achieve Catholic emancipation. He actually achieved a fair bit of what he set out to do, whereas Emmet didn't, other than to inspire others to follow. Or Madden, who he used to call as often as he could. He'd give her £50 or so at the time when he'd meet her. She even showed him the house that Emmet had rented, but she still didn't tell him who these other people were. I mean, he knew the names, people who had been executed. He knew those, but the other people, she didn't tell him anything about them. Never told anyone. She didn't tell Luke Cullen. She didn't tell, nobody did she tell this information to. No one. Kept it all to herself.
I think it's really important that she becomes better known. Most people only know of her as Robert Emmet's housekeeper, when she was so much more than that. Incredible
woman, staunch to the end. It's a sort of person you want with you in anything you plan. Who could keep a secret, but remain loyal to the idea as well, which she did all the way through. She believed, as Emmet did, in a free Ireland. She believed in a country that was free of religion, free of class. And that's where she'd be coming from, always. And I mean, she sacrificed her own family, in essence. They were treated badly because of her, because she wouldn't give in. Her younger brother died. It wasn't her fault, but part of the ill treatment. Little Jimmy died in prison. Her father almost died in prison and died shortly afterwards. Again, because of the bad conditions he was kept in. And if Anne had been willing, she could have negotiated their release. But that would have meant telling on others and informing on others, and that would have had them, of course, imprisoned as well. And that would, now, in fairness, her family never asked her to help. They never asked her to say anything either. But she could have if she'd wanted to. They had, Trevor and Sarah had offered this to her on occasion. But no, she didn't.
Well, she was definitely a woman of principle.
Yeah, absolutely. And probably in all of our history, the woman of most principle, I think, specific, as you could point to and say, look, here you are for 45 years. It's not just that he was steadfast for a year or for a few years. No, I mean many of them would have been obviously later on. You look at I've been looking recently at some of the people involved in the War of Independence, etc. And you see them going on, and okay, but that war finished and they just carried on their lives, and not negating that in any way, but there was no pressure on them afterwards. Once the Civil War was over, there was no great pressure on them to inform on what had gone before it to do anything else. But if Anne had been in 1916 or afterwards, I don't believe she would have made a witness statement. That would involve in telling on people. She wouldn't have done that, even in that situation, and she didn't do it. She didn't. We have her life story as told to Luke Cullen, told it to Ormet, but we don't actually have her life story. What we have is the story that they gleaned from her as they were asking her about the United Irishmen, because they were not interested in her at all, only in what she knew about Emmet and Jimmy Hope and etc. but would find out snippets of information along the way. And that's why the story you have of her is a very broken, choppy story. And you have to fill in bits on the way. But we're lucky that we have at least that much. We can appreciate her. And otherwise, she'd be lost. If she got mentioned at all, it'd be as Emmet's housekeeper, who was tortured. That's it. Nothing else. So it'd be funny enough, the question I get asked most often about it was she in love with Robert Emmet? I mean, unquestionably, she wasn't. She admired him. I am probably in love with him in the sense that a young girl today would be in love with a pop star. You know it's unreachable. It's a figure. You admire somebody and whatever, but out there, they're out there, and you would think you're in love with them or whatever. And she might well have felt this fascination with Emmet, certainly admiration for him, without a question. She knew he had a girlfriend. She thought she was a plain-looking girl, but but she thought she was a nice girl for all that. But no, she had no aspiration to that. She was obviously aware of the class differences as well between herself and Emmet, and they were things certainly which couldn't be bridged. Loyal, definitely on the same level as Emmet in terms of planning, in terms of aspiration, in terms of everything. But for all that, from a different class. That was it. But no, not in love. Admiring, yes. That was her, my hero.
I think it's fantastic that you're pushing her story all the time. And I really hope that you have some success with moving her husband to be in the same grave as her. Thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and we've learned a huge amount about Anne Devlin today.
It's absolutely my pleasure. My ideal is to talk about her. It's all I can do, really, is to talk about her.
And thank you all for listening. We'll be back again next month with another episode. So until then, slán go fóill.